Great. Now, all the co-hosts, actually, I make Alan a co-host as well. So, Alan, if you can keep track of who is in the waiting room.
So what have I got to do?
Keep track of who is in the waiting room and let them in.
Yeah, okay.
And naturally also keep track of if there's any problem, but yeah.
So I'm now a co-host.
I'm making you one. So you'll be able to see who is in the waiting room because I've turned off the sound now. So it won't make a sound when people enter the waiting room. So you have to keep an eye on it.
I'll see them.
Yeah.
So, oh, right, okay. Who's recording this?
Paul is.
Okay, shall I record it too?
If you want, yeah, why don't you?
Yeah, I will.
Are you plugged in? You better be.
I can. I mean,
you have a thing on the back there, some sockets there.
I don't know what you need, but I can record it.
Okay. Well, you should plug in your computer.
I will plug in a minute. You mean to electricity?
Yes.
Yeah, I'll plug into electricity. I've just got to change my views because I'm recording. I need to get the gallery view, so bear with me.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for attending this very important and interesting webinar. We will be starting in a couple of minutes. So, yeah, thank you for your patience.
Oh, it says I'm recording.
People are still joining, so we'll give them a minute or so to join.
Speaker.
And Alan, just so I'm not muted, you should know that. Okay, I think we can probably get going now. So let me find my notes and off we go. Oops, what's happening? Okay, so we'll get going now. Paul, are we live? Okay.
Live.
Great. And we are on, we are recording and we are on speaker view. Okay. Hello and welcome to this especially important and historic International Manifesto Group webinar on the US presidential elections. I'm Radhika Desai and I'm the convener of the International Manifesto Group. We have entitled this webinar Trump versus Harris, US citizens denied choice for people, planet, and peace. The webinar is co-sponsored by the Black Agenda Report, the Black Alliance for Peace, and the United National Anti-War Committee. So we are nearly there. We are nearly at the much anticipated, much fought over, and much dreaded election day, with the United States facing not only an historic presidential election, but rather another historic presidential election. Incidentally, it's historic for the International Manifesto Group also. The International Manifesto Group, as some of you may know, began meeting virtually at the beginning of COVID, and by the fall of that year, we felt that we were having some really interesting seminars or rather discussions, and began putting them up on the web. And as the US elections approached, we were at the same time thinking, why not start putting up webinars ourselves, as many other groups and organizations were doing. And indeed, we began our first webinar was about the upcoming US presidential election. So here we are again, 4 years later, still going and hopefully making a difference. Those elections, the 2020 elections, saw Biden defeat Trump narrowly, and with the results delayed for days, repeated attempts by Trump to contest the results and uncover what he claimed were the true ones, and then, just before Senate confirmation of the vote, what Democrats call an insurrectionary assault on US democracy. And as we all know, it hardly ended there. On the one hand, in the 4 years since, the Democrats have spared no expense and effort to try to convict Trump and his associates for the alleged crimes, unsuccessfully. On the other, the core of Trump's base not only held on to its conviction that the 2020 election was stolen from him, but also nursed it into a festering rage. For the third time, the battle will be fought across the same lines. For the third time, even more wild rhetoric has been spewed from both sides. And as we see, as Dr. Leon is going to tell us, with some important consequences. For the third time, the divides of US society have deepened. And perhaps more importantly, for the third time, whatever government is elected, if, and this is a big if, the electoral process does yield a legitimate rather than a contested result, will prove unable to arrest this slide of US politics into ever more suffocating levels of toxicity. That divide that has cleaved US politics down the middle is one between the globalizing, neoliberal, financialized corporate elite and the people. There is a solid core of some 40% of the electorate that remains stubbornly inaccessible to the corporate elite. This has transformed US politics. As one political scientist pointed out, between 1920 and 1984, the contest between the two parties resembled World War II, with a high level of mobility and rapid gains and losses of large swaths of territory. By contrast, the contemporary era, the era since about 1984, resembles World War I, with a single, mostly immobile line of battle and endless trench warfare. That the division opened and deepened during the neoliberal decades is hardly a surprise. Neoliberal policy produced the economic inequality on which the social division, political polarization, and cultural fragmentation of the culture wars have all rested. However, this political divide does not, or at least does not yet, represent any advance for the popular cause. On the contrary, it has placed frightening obstacles in its path. For rather than representing a clear drawing of battle lines between making the advance of the popular cause easier, the popular side, the side of the people, is actually divided between those being mobilized by an unscrupulous counter elite headed by Trump and his band of maverick or lumpen or warlord corporate CEOs like Elon Musk and so on, and the discouraged who are inspired by neither camp and who will threaten to stay home in droves on election day. This is where our panel fits in. It's composed of people who have long been concerned about this problem and have been part of building a strategy to take the politics of the people in another far better and far more hopeful direction. In the current election, it is represented broadly, at least, by Jill Stein, and was represented, by the way, in 2016 by one of our guests, Ajamu Baraka, who was then the running mate of Jill Stein, who also ran in 2016. Each one of our speakers is part of a larger organization and initiative, in fact, many. What does this election look like from our point of view? What, if any, are the paths leading out of these darkest of nights that US politics has entered? What can we do to put US politics on these paths? This is what our panel is here to tell us. I will introduce each speaker in our distinguished panel individually in turn, and then each will speak for about 10 to 15 minutes. And after they're all done, We will have comments and questions and answers. So let me begin by introducing our first speaker. Our first speaker is Dr. Wilmer Leon, and he's going first because he's agreed to do the hard job of presenting to us some of the numbers, the polling figures, the relevant electoral numbers from past elections, and so on. Dr. Wilmer Leon is a political scientist whose primary areas of expertise are Black politics, American government, and public policy. For 11 years, he was a lecturer and teaching associate at the Political Science Department of Howard University in Washington, D.C., the historic and great Black American school that is very well known. Currently, Dr. Leon is a nationally broadcast radio talk show host on Sirius XM satellite radio channel 126 and a host of the podcast Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon. He's also a nationally syndicated columnist, author of Politics, Another Perspective, and a regular political commentator on national and international news programs. So, Wilmer, the floor is yours. Please take it away and surprise us.
Well, thank you very much. I don't know what surprises there will be, but greetings, everyone. Dr. Desai, thank you for the opportunity to participate in this incredibly important discussion. I also want to thank Black Agenda Report and the United National Anti-War Committee for co-sponsoring this, as well as Black Agenda for Peace. In your opening comments, Dr. Desai, you quoted political scientist William Galston, who wrote, as you cited, between 1920 and 1984, the contest between the two parties resembled World War II, with a high level of mobility and rapid gains and losses of large swaths of territory. By the contrast, the contemporary era resembles World War I, with the single, mostly immobile line of battle and endless trench warfare. I suggest that during the 64-year period where the contest between the two parties resembled World War II, that there were multiple ideologies being debated and struggling for control, many of which had, as Dr. Frances Cress Welsing, what she called racism, white supremacy, undergirding them. And that today, that the contemporary era resembles World War I with a single, mostly immobile line of battle and endless trench warfare. And to me, that's because many of those earlier battles have been settled. And that both parties now in the American duopoly are now co-opted by the same benefactors. And so the battles, to a great degree, are more of form over substance. And I'm not presenting this as an absolute, but I believe that there is validity in that position. There are periods in history, epochs, times that are marked by notable events or particular characteristics, moments, events that shape or change the course or direction of history. Many times, I believe, while they're happening, people don't realize that they're actually in the moment. Columbus with his misguided self and his navigation of the globe, the Industrial Revolution, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Those are, to me, are some of those times where people didn't realize that they were in the moment. I believe right now we are in, not only in terms of American domestic politics, but in terms of the global geopolitical landscape, we are also now in one of those epochs. There are other events or moments that occur that in that moment, you know that life has changed forever. December 7th, 1941, the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Roosevelt told us yesterday, December 7th, a date which will live in infamy. April 4th, 1968, the assassination of Dr. King. July 20th, 1969, the Apollo lunar module, the Eagle, landed on the moon. September 26, 2022, the U.S. blows up the Nord Stream 2 pipelines. So today, right now, whether it's on the international or on the domestic fronts, America is recklessly muddling its way through these incredibly perilous times, very perilous and very recklessly. One of the real ironies to me in all of this is that most of, if not just about all of this peril that American President Joe Biden warns us about, and former President Donald Trump talks about keeping us safe from, these are problems of America's own making. They've brought these issues upon themselves. There are, as I just mentioned, periods, epochs, times that are marked by notable events. The American empire is truly on the wane. As you said in your open, the unscrupulous elite, and as you referenced, the counter elite headed by Trump and his band of maverick or lumpen or warlord corporate CEOs, they're, to me, in this death spiral, trying to salvage what has become the unsalvageable. They're trying to save a dying empire. The Greeks couldn't do it. The Romans couldn't do it. The Ottomans couldn't do it. There was a time when everyone in the world knew that the sun never set on the British Empire. Those days are long gone. So they're trying to salvage the unsalvageable. And in many instances, they're using scorched earth tactics to do so. And there is the adage, a man who will burn his own nation to the ground to rule over the ashes. That's what I see playing itself out. We're transitioning from a unipolar world dominated by the American imperialistic hegemon and its puppets, such as the EU, the World Bank, and the IMF, to a multipolar world that's being influenced and managed by organizations such as BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And the United States seems to be hell-bent on using militarism to try to offset what is really presenting itself as economic dynamics. And it's failing to do so. So many might ask, why have I spent so much of these opening remarks focusing on the foreign and not the domestic? Well, because as Dr. King wrote in the letter from Birmingham jail, quote, in a real sense, all life is interrelated. All men are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects us all indirectly. So, different context, but I think the quote still applies. The foreign and the domestic issues in the United States are inextricably linked. Vice President Harris said, for example, quote, as president, I will never waver in defense of America's security and ideals, because in the enduring struggle between democracy and tyranny, I know where I stand and where the United States belongs. If elected commander-in-chief of the U.S., she says, she will ensure that the country always has the strongest and most lethal fighting force. Well, what does that mean? How do you get there? And at what sacrifice? On whose dime? This, to me, is one of the great conflicts in American domestic politics, even though a lot of Americans don't really put these issues together. Because you can't reconcile the ledger. It doesn't foot. It doesn't tie. You can't reconcile guns and butter. You can't fund conflict on three fronts. And again, conflicts that the United States has started, if not four fronts, if you talk about what's happening on many other countries on the continent. You can't fund these conflicts and have a $25,000 first-time homebuyer credit. You can't fund these conflicts. You can't send $8 billion to Ukraine, $8.7 to the Zionist settler colony called Israel, $600 million to Taiwan. That's $17 billion that Joe Biden wrote off in one day. You can't do that. You can't send $17 billion abroad in one day and have a $25,000 first-time homebuyer credit. You can't have an opportunity economy. You sent that money abroad. You can't have more aircraft carriers, Tomahawk cruise missiles, and hypersonics, and still increase the child tax credit. How are you going to pay for that? You just can't get there from here. And as Shakespeare wrote in Hamlet, to sleep, perchance to dream, aye, therein lies the rub. So that wraps up my prepared comments. I don't know if you want me to get into what I see as some of the numbers being. You want me to do that now? Okay. So just this morning, in flipping some of the channels, MSNBC, I think they announced their latest and last polls for the election, and they call it a dead heat. I don't see it that way. I think the pollsters are making some of the same mistakes today in assessing this race as they made in the Obama-Romney race, where the day of the election, Romney was up by the polling numbers by 7 points, 7 to 10 points, depending on who you asked. And we know what that result was. It was a whipping. And I'm not saying that Vice President Harris is going to whip Donald Trump, but I do believe that she's going to win. A lot of people were looking for an October surprise. I believe his racist hate fest 2024 that was held last Saturday in New York, that's 6 hours of eugenic, racist, hate-filled rants, could very well wind up being that October surprise. And particularly, of all of the disgusting, vile things that were said, this one so-called comedian whose name I'm not even going to mention called Puerto Rico a floating island of garbage, which has sparked incredible fury from Republicans and Democrats. He said, there's a lot going on. I don't know if you know this, but there's literally a floating island of garbage in the middle of the ocean right now. I think it's called Puerto Rico. Pennsylvania is a swing state. Pennsylvania, they have, I think, 20 electoral votes in the Electoral College. And Trump won Pennsylvania in 2016 by the margin of 0.72%. Biden was able to reclaim the state, winning it by 1.7% or by in 2020, or by the margin of about 80,500 votes. Pennsylvania's Latino eligible voter population has more than doubled since 2000, from 206,000 to 620,000. That's according to census figures. More than half of those 620,000 voters are Puerto Rican and eligible to vote, and they're not happy. That is one data point that I think could impact Pennsylvania. I think it could help to offset what has been attributed to angry African Americans, particularly angry Black men in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, either deciding to vote for Trump or, which I don't think those numbers are nearly as great as they're being projected as. I think those angry Puerto Ricans in Pennsylvania, and they are really angry, could make, and I underscore could make a difference. So I see the election going this way. Harris 293, Trump 245. I also believe that the vice president could win, and I underscore could win, North Carolina, because when you look at the number of African Americans that did not vote in 2020 in North Carolina, I think the number might have been 1 million. And if you look at what Reverend Barber and other organizations in North Carolina that are tied to him, the voter outreach and voter turnout efforts, they've targeted something like, I think 3 to 5 million. I can't remember the numbers, but they're doing their best to offset the number of African Americans that did not turn out in 2020. And Trump only won North Carolina in 2020 by 74,000 votes. So I think this racist hate fest 2024 could do a whole lot to motivate and get a whole bunch of angry people of color to turn out in North Carolina. That's 16 electoral votes. Biden won Arizona in 2020, 11 electoral votes. He won them by 10,457,000. Whole lot of Latinos in Arizona that could turn out. And Florida, I'll even throw this out there. She might, Vice President Harris might even win Florida. Trump won Florida by 372,000 votes. You've got 500,000 Puerto Ricans in, I think, Central Florida. You got a whole lot of Puerto Ricans in Florida. They love their island. They love their flag. And so I see it as Harris 293, Trump 245. And my 293 does not include North Carolina, does not include Arizona, does not include Florida. So, and Trump will have a hell of a hard row to hoe if he loses North Carolina. So that is the end of my analysis at this moment.
That's absolutely great. Perfectly timed, Wilmer. Thank you so much. And it's going to be really interesting. You have made a very, very clear prediction. So we will have to see. And we will, by the way, audience members, please note that we are planning to have a post-election analysis seminar as well. But since we're unsure exactly when we'll know the result, we'll just plan it as we know when it might be a good time to have it. So let's go to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Sarah Flounders. Sarah, as most of you know, is a long-standing political activist and author based in New York City. She is contributing editor of Workers' World newspaper and a leader of the United National Anti-War Coalition, as well as the International Action Center and the Sanctions Kill campaign. She's co-author and editor of numerous books, including Capitalism on a Ventilator, The Impact of COVID-19 in China and the US, which she co-authored with Lee Soo-hin, and the recently released Sanctions, A Wrecking Ball in a Global Economy. So please go ahead, Sarah. You also have about 10 to 15 minutes, as you please.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Radhika. And thank you to the International Manifesto Group for organizing this meeting and a whole series of challenging discussions. It's so interesting to follow Dr. Wilmer Leon. My question I'm going to start with is, do the two parties in the US offer any meaningful choices? In my opinion, of the two major imperialist parties, neither offer a solution to the problems of the working class in the United States, let alone the rest of humanity. The phase in peaceful negotiations raised by China, that's now really part of popular terminology, is win-win in choices and in negotiations. A win-win means a collaborative approach where all parties involved benefit from the outcome. Well, US elections are a lose-lose choice. Either way, it's a lose-lose. Both parties serve the interests of the US imperialist ruling class. Both are parties of capitalism, of imperialism, of war. Both parties prepare for war to stall the decay of US world domination. And in the last 25 years, both parties have overseen devastating wars of aggression in Africa, in Europe, in Asia, and imposed coups and sanctions worldwide. But that's also true for the last 50 years and the last 75 years and 200 plus years. But here now, in 2024, both parties support NATO's proxy war against Russia. Both parties back surrounding China with US air and sea power. Just a minute. My notes here. And really sea power as well as economic war and tariff war against China. Both parties support imposing sanctions on a third of the world population, more than 40 countries. And that's an effort to impose starvation, artificial famines, disease, and underdevelopment. Most important in this election, and this is the decisive issue and a mass issue that resonates with millions, both parties support and arm Israel's genocide in Gaza that's now expanded to Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, and is always threatening Iran. Gaza is not an isolated event. The US empire is losing its hegemony. Its global position is irredeemably slipping off a cliff. And Gaza reveals the extent to which US imperialism and its Zionist proxies are willing to go to defend this dying empire. What working class organizations must analyze and prepare for is how to confront the post-election period. Since the two parties of imperialism have no real differences, their differences are in social composition and tactics. So it's true, the working class must prepare to fight them in different ways. But it is essential in this to recognize that the Democratic Party is a graveyard of progressive movements. It exists to suck in and grind up every progressive movement that could possibly challenge the status quo. And by refusing to step into the meat grinder, that's a political contribution. Trying to pull others away from this two-party fraud is an essential role in our organizing. Now, the Democratic Party clearly has no political agenda except defeat Trump. If Harris wins, just what have we won? It's a lose-lose. By refusing to address or fight for any working class issue, the Democrats are responsible for opening the road to fascist forces. A majority of the US population today is one paycheck away from ruin. This is also true in Europe, where social democrats abandon even the pretense of defending the working class from the assault on wages and essential social services. So millions begin to look elsewhere. This is based on a very real slide in the US empire. It's at a dead end with nothing to offer except war and threats of more war and repression. Screaming Trump equal fascism, while at the same time arresting thousands in rallies and encampments for Gaza and canceling thousands of student organizations that even mention Palestine, and shutting down hundreds of thousands of social media sites, and escalating police forces nationally, all while presiding over the largest prison population in the world. Such hypocrisy is not lost on millions, especially of young activists. Screaming Trump means the end of our democracy means you believe that what we now have is a democracy, not a plutocracy, the rule by billionaires who stop at nothing to defend their right to rule. Now, we all acknowledge Trump, Vance epitomize white supremacy, the demeaning of immigrants of color, of women, of LGBTQ plus people, especially transgender people, along with unions and working people. But fascism is not a personality disorder. The ruling class has no reason to impose a fascist dictatorship if left liberals and their confederates embrace the security state rather than oppose it. Extreme forms of repression are used by a system in crisis. Now, the slide of US politics into complete toxicity is not also based on personalities, and it did not start with Trump. The US empire allows only one political party loyal to capitalist rule and global imperialist domination, but it has two wings. And the Harris campaign, in demanding that millions of people, quote, choose the lesser evil, while openly arming the genocide in Gaza, this was not an oversight. There was no room for any Palestinian voice, even at the Democratic National Convention, which is always a grab bag of broken promises. Harris openly arms genocide and publicly brags about it at every campaign stop. How can we tell the difference between red and blue when Harris campaigns with Republican politician Liz Cheney and is endorsed by her father, the war criminal, Republican Vice President Dick Cheney, a driving force behind the US invasion and occupation of Iraq? Or when she campaigns and applauds John Bolton, architect of illegal US interventions around Latin America? It's significant that the 2024, the Democrats made no promises this time of higher minimum wage, of support for union organizing, of forgiving college loans, of better health care. They're devoid of even false promises, because US imperialism is spiraling downward. Almost the only issue Democrats campaigned on is reproductive rights. After the Democrats sat on the issue for 16 years and took no steps on the federal level to block or later to reverse the Supreme Court ruling. Think back, Obama in 2008 made passage of the Freedom of Choice Act the centerpiece of his campaign, and then did nothing while he held the White House and the majority of both houses of Congress. And then it was the same for Biden. He had the White House, a majority of both houses of Congress in 2020, and did nothing. But both Democratic Party presidents, when they had a majority mandate, could have enshrined abortion rights into law and out of the purview of the Supreme Court. Instead, both cynically sat on their promises because this was a sure card to play in an election ploy. That is beyond cynicism. Both campaigns reach out to the right and really drag the whole political movement to the right. They spent over $16 billion in this frantic media hype. Now, any third party can't raise 1/100th of 1% of $16 billion. The Republican and Democratic parties are part of the same corporate duopoly, both of which support the US empire. And that is their role in the empire. So, in my opinion, we need to confront and denounce these war criminals and this criminal racist situation. We need to really think how to prepare for what comes after 2024, November 5th. That's the date that is approaching us, and the date we have to really look at. We need to link the billions spent for endless war around the world concretely to the needs of millions of working people here in the US. 3% of US military spending could end world hunger, and that's just the beginning. But I want to end with the analogy that was made to World War I. Is this election World War I? Well, let's remember that World War I ended in a revolutionary upheaval where the masses took the stage, the millions, the workers and peasants who were completely ignored, their interests never addressed. So to refuse to go along with imperialist war was the Bolsheviks. Now, they were so much smaller, almost irrelevant at the beginning of the war, but they were more prepared. And I think on this panel also, and when you look at the movement today that is determinately anti-imperialist, they're more prepared for what comes ahead. It's not easy to say or do this, but it is the only way forward. As Amilcar Cabral reminded us, tell no lies and claim no easy victories. Thank you.
That was really brilliant, Sarah. Thank you. I loved the extension of the analogy of the First World War, and I think this is the sort of outcome we are all looking for. And you also made the fact that I'm hosting this from Russia today, perhaps more deeply significant. But anyway, let us go on. There will be lots of discussions. And by the way, I keep meaning to say, I meant to say this earlier. Please, all the speakers, do keep an eye on the chat, because there are probably points in the chat that you want to respond to. So you may be, but of course there will probably also be lots of questions and answers later. Okay, onward and upward to our third speaker. Our third speaker is Ajamo Baraka, no stranger to presidential elections. As most of you will know, he was vice presidential candidate in the 2016 election when Jill Stein ran as well. And Ajamo is also the national organizer of the Black Alliance for Peace, a very important organization, anti-imperialist organization. And once again, of course, it is the defeat in imperialist wars that often bring about the end of capitalist regimes, and hopefully we're going somewhere in that direction. Ajamo, as I said, was a 2016 candidate for vice president on the Green Party ticket. He also serves on the executive committee of the United States Peace Council and the leadership body of the United National Anti-War Coalition. He's an editor and contributing columnist for Black Agenda Report and contributing columnist for Counterpunch. He was recently awarded the U.S. Peace Memorial 2019 Peace Prize and the Serena Shrim Award for uncompromised integrity in journalism. So, Ajamo, please go ahead.
Well, thank you so much for allowing me to participate in this very, very important conversation. I'm really looking forward to the Q&A. I have a few questions myself for my dear friend, Dr. Leon, who has shared with us his fascinating analysis of the potential numbers. I tend to have an alternative view of what is likely to unfold in a few days. In fact, I think that it's probably going to end up being potentially a rout on the side of the Trump forces, but we will see in a few days. So my brief comments, I'm going to move us to the post election period. Many people say that this election in a few days represents an extraordinary conjuncture that will lead to epoch-changing developments in the U.S. and by extension, the world. I'm not convinced. There's no question that the election, no matter which of the two main capitalist parties of the U.S. bourgeoisie wins, it will signify a step toward what I refer to as convergence politics. That is, the consolidation of a right-wing politics reflective of the overall project of the bourgeoisie as a class to preserve its rule. That is, more open and obvious fascism as a system preserving reform. For me, this process will be fully accomplished, not in 2024, but probably in a few years, definitely by the election of 2028. But the only thing that could perhaps put a brake on that or to alter it somewhat would be a challenge coming from the corrupted mainstream official opposition. We have efforts like the Block and Build, based on what I think is a discredited strategy among Democrats or progressive forces who are aligned with the Democratic Party, that Democratic administrations can be moved to the right positions. And this is something that there's no evidence that that has been effectively executed in the last few decades, but it still becomes a mantra that people who are prepared to collaborate with the neoliberal Democrats will use every election, really beginning around 1984. It also is unlikely that we are going to see a truly revived left emanating. We have to attempt to try to build that because that is the only force I think that can provide an alternative to the trajectory of politics in this country that is rapidly moving to the full consolidation of neo-fascism. So why do I take this position? Well, because in terms of a material reality, neoliberal capitalist contradictions cannot be overcome. Capitalist reform is no longer available. The only capitalist reform will be fascism. And people have to remember that, unlike the popularity of these liberal notions of fascism, fueled by these corrupt and backward, bad Hitler movies, fascism is a manifestation of class politics. Okay, and it can emanate from a movement similar to what we saw emerge in Europe with nationalist parties, but even more importantly, it can emanate from the top down. What we are, in fact, seeing, in my opinion, coming from the most dominant sector of capital, neoliberal finance capital, that is actively and aggressively consolidating this fascistic rule, making it very, very difficult, if almost impossible, for an effective opposition to emerge in this country. Now, this is not something that's new. I mean, this capitalist fight back, if you will, really started in the 1970s. I mean, it started in the 60s too, as we consolidated our opposition forces, particularly the Black Liberation Movement. But by the early 1970s, as our movement was being defeated militarily and politically, we saw that there was a consolidation on the part of the bourgeoisie, partly motivated by the infamous Powell memo that basically told the bourgeoisie, if you want to preserve this thing, you better fight for it. And that, in fact, is what they did. And we saw the beginnings of that fight back and what we referred to as neoliberalism with the coup in 1973 in Chile and with the progressive move toward the right and the imposition and development of what we refer to today as neoliberalism, beginning with Jimmy Carter, consolidating under Reagan and Thatcher in the 80s, and further consolidating with the ascendancy of the Democratic Leadership Council under the right-wing Democrats, Bill Clinton, and it goes on and on with the full consolidation, if you will, in my opinion, that occurred with the merging of neoconservatism and liberal interventionists under or during the Obama administration, and the open abandonment of the Republican Party by neoliberals under or during the campaign of Hillary Clinton. So that this migration of neoliberalism that first really emerged politically in the US in the Republican Party has now consolidated itself in the right-wing neo-fascist party of the Democrats. And that is very, very important, my friends, because, we've got to be able to deal with the ideological confusion around this issue of fascism and what I consider to be the diversionary politics of only focusing in on these very dangerous and fascistic tendencies represented by Trumpism, while giving a free hand to what I've been arguing for the last few years, and many people know this, that it's the neoliberal Democrats, the international finance capital dominant wing of the state that's been consolidating and driving fascistic politics in the US and globally. That in fact, neoliberalism is the cutting edge of fascism. and we are missing the boat by just focusing in on the obvious, the obvious examples or models of this notion of fascism. So this is where we have to begin to focus. Now, look, one of the reasons why we have such a possibility of the Trump forces reemerging in the white people's house, the White House, here in 2024, is because of this hegemony of neoliberalism with the in the Democrat Party. They had plenty of opportunities to frame their politics in a way that would have spoke to some of the concerns, the anxieties of the working classes in the U.S. But they were unable to do that because of the corruption of their politics by their donors. One quick example: the Build Back Better process, and in particular the element that was referred to as the American Families Plan, that provided some policies that could have served as a foundation for the Harris campaign here in 2024 if they would not have basically undermined themselves by abandoning some of those measures. I mean, you know, we have already seen the bipartisan collaboration between the two parties on issues like the military budget and then climate legislation, or the so-called Inflation Reduction Act. But the Democrats had an opportunity to carve out an alternative. When you had things like on the table, the permanent child tax credit that literally brought millions of children out of poverty. The proposal for paid paternal and medical leave. Resources for pre-K education, very, very important for the working class. Child care, free community college, okay? Money for housing, and removing some of the restrictive legislation that prevents people who have been convicted in this mass incarceration regime to be able to live with some measure of dignity, you know, by having access to food benefit programs under SNAP. So they did not do this. In fact, we saw the games they played when they disconnected this legislation from their Inflation Reduction Act and the infrastructure bill. When they separated that from the infrastructure bill, it was basically over with. But the progressives play games with the U.S. population, pretending that these elements will be reintroduced at a later date. This is a reality that the Democrats have to deal with. This is a reality that we have to deal with. I'm comment very briefly on what those realities are and how we have to move toward solving or addressing these concrete realities beyond the election. As I said, there's been consistent bipartisan agreement on the major class positions, be it the budget, military budget, and be it the current thrust toward imperialist domination. This is fueled by a very clear strategy that's ended up in their national security documents. That is this commitment to full spectrum domination. And they are very clear about that. And that full spectrum domination is political, economic, military, but they have decided that they're going to use the military first strategy to ensure the continuation of their global hegemony. And this is, we're not going to go into details on this, but this is reflected in the Biden war, proxy war in Ukraine. We see that they are attempting to complete the pivot to Asia. We see a more intense subversion in the Americas and on the African continent. We look at what's happening with Haiti, the expansion of AFRICOM, the undermining of the Sahel Alliance. We see the disarray now and destabilization taking place in Mozambique, this grinding, obscene war in Sudan. We know that the people in Yemen are getting prepared for an imminent invasion, perhaps on the ground, from the fascists that are in power in Israel, and the possibility of a direct attack on Iran. This is the militarization at the center of the U.S. imperialist project to try to maintain their global capitalist and white supremacy. To do that, though, you have to have another element, and that is the containment of domestic opposition. We saw this happen historically at the end of the Second Imperialist War, World War II, where the containment strategy wasn't just a military one. People make that mistake all the time. Containment had a very strong ideological component, okay? And the containment globally had to have containment domestically. And that was the foundation for the so-called McCarthyism, to basically undermine any domestic opposition to the consolidation of U.S. imperialist programs and projects. We see the same thing happening today. That basically, if you're going to have a strategy based on militarism, on war, you have to undermine any domestic opposition. And I will argue that the undermining of domestic opposition is even more intense and more dangerous than even in the early 1950s. And we see the examples of this. They are criminalizing opposition. We see what happened in Atlanta with the use of RICO to undermine and to intimidate and to criminalize opposition to Cop City in Atlanta, and by extension, the Cop City movement across the country to oppose the militarization of the police forces. The Uhuru 3, the folks don't want to talk about and are confused into believing that if you keep your head down, that basically the state is not going to come after you. Not understanding that the prosecution of the Uhuru 3 was a shot across the bow. And when you all did not mobilize in response to and support of the Uhuru 3, it has endangered all of us, okay? Censorship. We see the massive censorship taking place, again, being driven by neoliberal Democrats, this alignment between themselves and the legacy media and big tech. The harassment that we're all facing when we go across borders today. It's all part of this process of tightening the internal repressive apparatus in this country, fundamentally of what they need. As I move now toward my closure, we've got to understand that this struggle, it goes beyond the election cycles, okay? That the short term, of course, can be for many people to express their opposition to the warmongering of the duopoly, cast their vote for Jill Stein or Claudia de la Cruz. It's really been a progressive move made by the Stein campaign and the de la Cruz campaign, calling for them to support each other in various states. Very, very important. But longer term, we've got to then understand our opposition has to be one based on more solid organization. That we have to begin to move, my friends, toward, in my opinion, more open socialist politics and building more effective class-based, but not reductionist, multinational, multiracial formations, while also recognizing the legitimate positions of colonized non-European populations to independent politics and self-determination. This must be the basis for a new radical politics in the US that is anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist, committed to identifying and confronting all manifestations of white supremacist ideology and all forms of social oppression. This task is not limited to election cycles, my friends, but instead is a historic task and responsibility of all who believe in the possibility that collective humanity can build something better than this capitalist dystopia that we see in the US and in the West and in some parts of the globe. That's our task, that's our responsibility, and we've got to get to it. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ajamu. That was really very important, very powerful, in fact. And I just wanted to maybe say very briefly, well, three quick things. Number one, I think you can actually make a very good case that the Democrats are structurally fascists, whereas the Republicans are fascists in terms of their movement. But that's another big discussion we could have. But there's certainly an element of truth there. Secondly, Build Back Better and the American Families Act and whatever, these programs really, I mean, they perhaps in some vague version might have created a more progressive politics, but really all Biden's policies have been nothing more than big bonanzas for big business. That's all, that's the only reason they exist, but that's another thing as well. And finally, in the question and answer, I would have asked you to elaborate now, but in the question and answer, you're going to have to give your figures for what you think is going to happen. But for now, let us move to our fourth and final speaker and most wonderful speaker, perhaps I should say, and that's Margaret Kimberley. And Margaret will wish to be introduced only very briefly, and that is as follows. She is executive editor and senior columnist at Black Agenda Report and author of Prejudential, Black America and the Presidents, which is a fascinating book. So, Margaret, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Radhika, and greetings, everyone. Excuse me. I'm very honored to be invited once again to participate in an International Manifesto Group webinar. We're speaking just 2 days away from the 2024 presidential election in the United States. And I'll begin by quoting the great scholar W.E.B. Du Bois. On October 20th, 1956, he declared in an essay published in The Nation magazine entitled, "I Won't Vote." He said, quote, "Stop running Russia and giving Chinese advice when we cannot rule ourselves decently. Stop yelling about a democracy we do not have. Democracy is dead in the United States," unquote. Those words may as well have been written in 2024 as in 1956, as Du Bois recounted trying to navigate the US political system over many years, which is especially difficult when wanting to have an outcome that is in any way favorable or even less evil for Black people. He goes on, quote, "In 1912, I wanted to support Theodore Roosevelt, but his Bull Moose Convention dodged the Negro problem, and I tried to help elect Wilson as a liberal Southerner. Under Wilson came the worst attempt at Jim Crow legislation and discrimination in civil service that we had experienced since the Civil War. In 1916, I took Hughes as the lesser of two evils. He promised Negroes nothing and kept his word. In 1920, I supported Harding because of his promise to liberate Haiti," which didn't happen for another 15 years, I add. "In 1924, I voted for La Follette, although I knew he could not be elected. In 1928, Negroes faced an absolute dilemma. Neither Hoover nor Smith wanted the Negro vote, and both publicly insulted us," unquote. And I've seen these dynamics my entire life, as Black people feel trapped by electoralism and vote for what has been the Black People's Party since the 1960s, the Democrats. We voted for Jimmy Carter even after he spoke of keeping ethnic purity in neighborhoods, and Bill Clinton used Black prisoners in a photo opportunity, or Barack Obama, as he scolded Black men as being irresponsible and bad fathers, and Joe Biden, who bragged about shepherding Bill Clinton's racist crime bill through the Senate, and who had spoken of a racial jungle. Now we are told that Kamala Harris, a mediocrity who can barely express herself, a hollow woman without conviction, whose career is the result of rich Democrats promoting her, is some sort of savior for Black people and for left-leaning Democrats. Of course, running against Donald Trump gives just about anyone more gravitas than they deserve, but it's especially insulting now, as Kamala Harris has pledged to continue the US-Israeli genocide. I know she claims to want a ceasefire, but that is completely disingenuous, as she also pledges to continue arming Israel. She speaks to us as though we are stupid, pretending that the US president, the one person on earth who could end the genocide, is somehow prevented from doing so. But there are always larger forces at play. I don't think we should discuss US politics without pointing out that the duopoly parties, the Republicans and Democrats, are controlled by the US oligarchs. And we can see that in the amount of money that they raise. As of October 25th, The Harris campaign has raised $997.2 million. In other words, $1 billion. Trump is far behind with a mere $388 million. Not only has Harris raised that $1 billion that Democrats usually do, but she's done so faster than any other Democratic presidential candidate before her. In a nutshell, this tells the story of why US citizens are denied a choice for peace, people, and planet. Just listen to Larry Fink. He's a billionaire and the CEO of the BlackRock hedge funds. He said, "I'm tired of hearing this is the biggest election in our lifetime. The reality is over time, it doesn't matter for the markets." And he added that BlackRock is having conversations with both Harris and Trump. It reminds me of a similar statement made by the CEO of Boeing, a defense contractor, during the 2020 election between Trump and Joe Biden. He said, "I think both candidates, at least in my view, appear globally oriented and interested in the defense of our country, and I believe they'll support the industries. They'll do it in different ways and they'll have different terms for sure, but I don't think we're going to take a position on one being better than the other." Now, if there were any differences between the two parties, there would be a difference in the markets or in defense spending. Shouldn't there be a difference depending upon who wins? There's another lack of difference that should be pointed out. Studies have shown that economic elites and organized groups representing business interests have substantial independent impacts on US government policy, while average citizens and mass-based interest groups have little or no independent influence. Yet we're exhorted to vote. In the US, we're not exhorted to or encouraged to do much else, just to vote and not to ask too many questions about who we should vote for. We are told we cannot consider anyone outside of the two-party duopoly, and that doing so is dangerous. That is why The Nation, an allegedly leftist publication, which published Du Bois's essay 78 years ago, now publishes hit pieces against Green Party candidate Jill Stein. Someone named James Fox, a documentary filmmaker, was given space in The Nation just 2 days ago to declare that environmentalists must vote for Kamala Harris, who swears she will not ban fracking and she'll continue increasing oil output. In other words, she'll accelerate climate change. We are told to ignore her words and vote instead for the person pledged to change US policy, and not to vote for the person pledged to change US policy to protect the environment. While Harris promises not just to continue military spending, but to make sure that the US military is the most lethal, she's chosen that word several times, the most lethal in the world. And as we all know, that means making sure it continues to be the world's biggest polluter. How can it not be, with more than 800 US military bases and facilities around the world? There are forces very actively preventing choice for the people. Here in New York State, where I live, former Governor Andrew Cuomo changed the nominating rules and made it very difficult for small, read less rich parties to be on the ballot. New York is now the only state in the union where voters can only choose between Harris or Trump. Candidates like Jill Stein or Claudia de la Cruz must be written in by voters and get at least 130,000 votes in order for their parties to have ballot status. Anyone who wants to vote outside of the duopoly is derided as a pro-Trump supporter or a danger to democracy itself. We are in fact the ones upholding democracy, which, if it means anything, should mean that the will of the people can be heard and that voters have choice. But choice is the last thing that liberals in particular want us to have. European Green parties were directed by someone to tell voters in the US not to vote for Stein. This clearly coordinated attack was quite phony. We know that German Greens, for example, are pro-war, pro-genocide. Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock, a Green, stated quite clearly that she supports Israeli war crimes. saying that civilians cannot be guaranteed safety, a clear violation of the Geneva Conventions. But most people don't know that US Greens are further to the left than the Europeans who claim that same label. But it is interesting that despite the Democrats' fundraising success, they are not far ahead of Trump in the polls. Why is the party that does so much better at fundraising only even with the Republicans? We are told only that Trump supporters are deplorable, racist garbage, while it's never pointed out the lack of difference between the two parties, and that explains why Trump is equally popular. If there were a difference, if working people were given better advantage by one party over the other, as the Democrats claim to do, Harris would be far ahead of Trump. I also believe that polls undercut Trump's support, and I won't be surprised if he wins. But as we're discussing today, the lack of choice is a feature of the US political system. And anyone who claims to change it in even a small way is driven out by both parties, the corporate media and politicians. Hence, we have a race that's closer than it should be. I also want to add that Democrats claim to support so-called social issues, such as abortion rights, and that these claims are also phony. Let's remember in 2008, as someone else pointed out, that Barack Obama campaigned saying he would codify the Roe v. Wade Supreme Court decision with legislation. Yet just a few months into office, he said it wasn't his highest priority. It wasn't a priority at all. He made no effort to pass it, even when he had large majorities in both houses of Congress his first 2 years in office. Now we are told that even if we want to punish the Democrats for genocide, we should vote for Harris anyway because she'll protect abortion rights. I doubt she would do so, even if Democrats win both houses of Congress. That is because the people are never a priority. The CEOs of hedge funds and defense contractors are the priority for both capitalist parties. Issues such as abortion are used to fool people and to give an appearance of difference where there is none. As Sarah pointed out, Democrats have now given up even making their false promises. Harris doesn't even claim, as Biden did in 2020, that she'll raise the minimum wage. So yes, USians are denied choice for the things they want. Most people in this country want a higher minimum wage, lower defense spending, an end to killing in Gaza, but all of those things are off the table. After writing my book, Prejudential Black America and the Presidents, I want to remind Black people especially that the desire for a good for Black people president is illusory, a political hustle. We will have to struggle, regardless of who is the winner on election day. So many people are hopeful for Harris and will breathe a sigh of relief if she wins and despair if Trump wins. The truth is we will have to struggle regardless of the electoral outcome. I think it is positive to recognize what we must do in order to survive. Wishful thinking is not positive. Humanity achieves change only when we are inspired and dedicated to being mobilized on our own behalf. So thank you. Thank you so very much for this opportunity.
And thank you, Margaret. That was again brilliant, a great rundown of key historical facts and the false choices that Americans and Black Americans in particular have been faced with for more than a century. So that was really brilliant. Great. Okay, folks, so now we have time for questions and answers. So if you would please, those of you who have questions, if you would please use the raise hand function at the bottom of the screen, you should be able to see. Let me see where it is. I've seem to have a new version of this now. 1 second, let me just go to full screen, and there should be a raise hand function. Do people see a raise hand function? I can, yeah, Lynn Siegel has found the raise hand function, as have Yuri. So Lynn and Yuri, you are the first two people with questions. We'll take 2 or 3 questions, and then we will go to the panels and then return for some more questions and go back to the panel. So Lynn, please go ahead. Lynn, can you oh, hang on. I know what's wrong. Please let me rectify it. Where are you? Okay, yeah, you have successfully unmuted yourself. Please go ahead.
So can Jill Stein get in 28 or in 32?
That's your question.
Yeah.
Great, brilliant, brief and to the point, sweet and short. Yuri, try to follow Lynn's example. Please go ahead. You are still muted.
Unmute.
Okay, that's it. That's good.
Okay, all right. I'll try to be as short as can be. If Dr. Stein or Claudia de la Cruz doesn't get the 5% needed to get federal funds to grow the party, do you think then the panelists that the party that the Green Party's PSL should then just be a huge advocacy organization, which then tries to influence the Democrats, and that this election and that the next election we just do what the French always do, which is hold the nose when it's a Macron or a Chirac or a Sarkozy to block a Le Pen, but then mobilize like hell against the dominant ruling party's endless austerity and wars. Thank you.
Lovely, Yuri. Thank you so much. And I had, before we even began, a question from Pat Taub from Portland, Maine. And she also has a very related question. She asks he asks, sorry, I should not have known. Anyway, they ask, once the election is over, how do we mobilize for a people's third party? So these are the very interrelated questions. And let me throw in a couple more things. I know, Ajamo, when you began, you said that you wanted to, you had some questions for Wilmer about his figures. And I also wanted you, Ajamo, to be clearer about what figures you were going on, because I think you seem to say that you seem to have a very different view of what would happen on Tuesday or when we know the election results. So maybe if we can begin with that, and maybe Ajamo, we begin with you, go to Wilma, and then Sarah and Margaret in that order, and let everybody say whatever they want to say about what they think the outcome will be, and then this larger question of what to do for the left. So please go ahead, Ajamo. Maybe Ajamo has stepped aside for a minute. No, he's here. You can see him. Ajamo, you're just unmuted yourself. Okay,
I
go ahead.
couldn't. You had it so that I couldn't unmute.
Yeah.
No, I think that my reading of what potentially may happen on Tuesday is a little bit different. Now I'll start with what appears to be a tie that people didn't really anticipate in Virginia, and the possibility that there could be, in fact, a Trump win, because we know that historically, meaning the last time that Trump ran, that the polls were often off, and then even subsequent polls of Trump supporters, we have found that potential Trump supporters are less likely to respond or even respond accurately to their voting preference. So his support tends to be a little underestimated. So if Virginia is in play, and in fact, if he's won, I think it's really just about lights out for the Harris campaign. It's quite clear that they're not going to, Harris campaign is not going to take Michigan. And if that's the case, they have their route to 270 is severely undermined. I don't see where they make it up any other place. I don't see them. My dear friend thought that there was a possibility of them picking up North Carolina. Perhaps I don't see it in North Carolina. And I think the possibility of a pickup any other place in those southern swing states is highly unlikely. So I think that, I don't see it being that close in terms of the electoral college. I think it's going to be clearly in favor of Trump, but could even face the possibility, I think, of a rout more so than people realize.
Great, thanks. And did you want to add anything about the larger question of third party, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, I think that I appreciate the question for Yuri. I think that this post-election period, there has to be some serious conversations around how we begin to move toward trying to consolidate a left in the U.S., a left that not only can be more effectively involved in the politics of, in general, the politics of that country, but also a left that might even participate in the constantly narrowing bourgeois political process in the U.S. So I don't think that there's going to be any breakthrough formations. People have to remember that, for example, PSL is in fact a political party, a pretty effective political party that's going to continue to do what it's doing, using this election process to build their formation. I think the Green Party will attempt to do the same thing. Whether or not there's going to be a foundation for more open left collaboration remains to be seen. But I do think it was a positive move on the part of PSL and the Stein campaign to pledge to support each other in these various states where one or the other may not be on the ballot. And they even invited the West campaign for them to support the West campaign in Alaska, I think it was. So that kind of collaboration is I think a very positive step forward for the pretty fragmented and competitive so-called left we have in the U.S.
Okay, great. I think I saw some people raising a clapping hand rather than a raise hand. So if you're making that mistake, please don't. There's a separate raise hand function and a separate function for clapping your hands. So if that's what you were actually doing, that's fine. But otherwise, please do the correct thing. Okay, on to Dr. Leon. Vilma, please go ahead.
Oh, well, thank you all. I can't debate Brother Baraka in his analysis. He's spot on more times than not. I will just say that when I look at the early voting turnout in North Carolina, in Georgia, in Arizona, all across the country, what we're hearing is historic early voter turnout. In North Carolina, 4.2 million. This term as opposed to 3.6 in 2020, 4 million as of Friday in Georgia, 4 million early voter turnout exceeded 2.7 in 2020. Arizona, surprisingly, 590,000 Republicans to 486,000 Democrats turned out early. 326,000 independents turned out early in Arizona. The other thing that I looked at is the gender breakdown. 53% women voting early to 44% men, with the issue of women's right to health care being an issue for many. That was a signal to me as well. So those are just some of the I don't say that to debate. I just say that to throw out, to give some people some idea and what I was looking at in terms of the numbers that I tabulated. And the Michigan point is a great point. And that could be and with Michigan, then Vice President Harris could also have a problem, not only with Michigan, but with Wisconsin and with Minnesota, because you have very large Arab/Muslim populations in those other two states as well. And so when you have people who are looking at politics in the context of the United States is killing my family, which you'll hear from many Muslims and many Arab Americans saying they're killing my family in Gaza. That's a hard position to compromise on. And the other point quickly, in terms of Dr. Stein and the Green Party, I would hope that moving forward that the Green Party is able to develop other candidates besides Dr. Stein. And this is not a knock on her, but by the time we get to the next cycle, I want to say this will be her fourth run. And we know that, you know, running 4 times at anything and not prevailing in the previous attempts can be a challenge to overcome. And I've been saying to people who want to talk about protest votes, I'm not going to vote for Kamala Harris. My protest vote is Donald Trump. I've been saying to them, your more effective protest vote, if that is why you're doing this, is third party. If you look at the long game, then if you want to cast a ballot in protest, because strengthening the third party, strengthening the Green Party in an American duopoly, that's where your most significant protest will be registered.
Thanks very much, Wilma. And I can't emphasize that more. I mean, we're not really out here recommending things, but I suppose we should. I mean, I agree. I think the third party protest vote is the best vote. If you're disgusted by both options, please vote Jill Stein. Please vote third party, but vote. Okay. I had Sarah and then Margaret.
Well, thank you. I want to say I'm not any authority on swing states, on votes, on proportions, on really what happens on Tuesday. I'm more absorbed in what we're doing on Wednesday and Thursday and Friday and into the future. I have been really more absorbed in the campaigns to end U.S. sanctions around the world, in the many Palestine protests that have reached such horrendous repression and shutdowns, in answering the propaganda against China, which is reaching an all-time high, both campaigns. So I do worry that the focus on a completely controlled electoral process forces people into thinking that's political participation, and it's not. Now, the third party, both the Party for Socialism and Liberation and the Green Party, Claudia Dela Cruz, Jill Stein, that's an important protest vote. And it is a protest vote. In other words, they are running, putting forth a campaign of issues that should be on the agenda. But the US electoral system is set up to really never allow such issues to come to the forefront or such parties to succeed. So I'm not against running a campaign of a protest vote, and what you do on Tuesday, vote for either party, depending on who's on the ballot, that's fine. But our challenge, I think, is to think beyond that, because this electoral system won't in any way address our needs for change in a system that is so corrupt and so decayed and so unable to provide, and that is making war on the world. So that is my both my level of attention to try to get people to think outside this completely stacked deck. So I don't know. I hope that explains my view in this, and I've participated in protest votes and third party efforts in the past. I think it's an important way of raising 10 points of what the election should be responding to. But the bigger question is what we're doing on the ground, and that we got to break this hope that any change is going to come through elections. That is intended to create a passivity, in my opinion.
Well, I mean, I'll just say that, not only is it very difficult for third parties to even get on the ballot, but the Democrats have made it so difficult for the Stein campaign to even get there that, in fact, they have an enormously wonderful and generous vision, which has had absolutely no airtime because they have struggled just to get on the ballot. But I say too much. Margaret, please go ahead.
Well, I don't have access to all the polling data, but I recall Hillary Clinton being ahead of Trump in 2016. I believe polls always undercount Trump's support. And I think if it's close, that means Trump is in fact ahead. That's my general take on any prediction. As far as the Greens cultivating new people, there was an effort, lest we forget, for Cornel West to run as a Green. He ultimately chose not to. That's a whole other story. But I also want to say, there's a lot of phoniness about people who know nothing about the Green Party saying Greens don't do anything. They only show up every 4 years. The media only pay attention to the Greens every 4 years. Greens run all the time, all over the country. And my response to those people now is, oh, so you want to help organize the Green Party? Tell me what state you're in, and I'll tell you who to get in touch with, since you're so concerned about what Greens do or don't do. But of course, the argument is one that is completely phony. But there is a bigger question of how much weight we give to the electoral process. It's difficult to ignore, but we are relegated to this tiny status with the help of the corporate media. And I think we have to talk about the role they play in telling people you don't have a choice. It's just Harris or Trump or whoever's the Democrat and whoever is the Republican, and that any other choice is a bad one, as if voting for genocide is not a bad thing. And I want to add something else. The Harris campaign has backed itself into such a corner. They even refuse to allow a group of Palestinians, I think it's the Uncommitted Movement, who gave some milquetoast criticism of Gaza, who wanted to speak at the convention and still endorse her. They have ignored them anyway. Who showed up in Dearborn, Michigan, with the large Arab population? Trump. And I think that is an indicator of what's going to happen. Rania Khalek has said, great journalist, that a lot of that large Arab population in Michigan is ready to vote for Trump just because he's a wild card. They know that Harris will continue the genocide, and they're willing to vote for him. So I think that shows the bankruptcy of this electoral system, of this duopoly, that people are convinced that they don't, in fact, have choices when we do. But people think that also because of the propaganda from the corporate media who work hand in hand with the duopoly.
Thanks very much, Margaret.
Radical, let me just jump in real quick. Just one
Sure,
piece of information to build off of what Margaret just said about the states, the Michigan in particular. Right now, the leading candidate among Arab and Muslim voters is, in fact, Jill Stein at 43%.
Oh, really? Great. Thanks very much. Okay, so we are at the 1.5 hour mark, at the 90-minute mark. And what I'd like to do, we have 5 people who have questions. So in order to speed things up slightly, I will request them that if their question is for a particular speaker, please name that, because the first set of questions were very general and I knew all the speakers would have something to say. But if you would like to direct your question at a particular speaker, don't hesitate to do so. So I will just go in the order in which I can see the names. So first, Francis Lawrence, please go ahead. Yeah, unmute.
Hello, I'm unmuted. This is a question I'll pose to Ajamu. A moment in history is the fact that Ukraine is on the verge of total collapse. Post-election, how likely is it that the US and NATO will intervene directly against Russia? And how will that play out in the US given the fact that the anti-war movement in this country is quite weak?
Great, thank you very much. Next, I see Barbara Kay. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. This is for anybody who wants to answer it. I like to share an observation, and I would like to get comments from the knowledgeable people on the panel. My observation over 20 years or so has been that people in America, voters in America who identify as right, Tea Party people and so on, they know what they want and they go for it, and they demand candidates who are more and more to their agenda. So we end up with Marjorie Taylor Greene, and we end up with Trump, for example. People who identify on the left, on the other hand, are so, I don't know, I mean, like so namby-pamby and like, oh, I would like this, but we can't get it. So I got to hold my nose and I got to vote for bourgeoisie, capitalist, imperialist, genocidists, and maybe they have black skin, etc. So that's my comment. That's what I observe, and it's like a difference in consciousness in the two groups. Very self-defeating on the so-called left, many of them.
Well, great. Sorry. Great comment. That's great, and I'm sure that there will be some interesting reactions from the panel. Next, I go to Colin Thomas. Please go ahead, Colin.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you everyone for the speakers. I really appreciate your viewpoints. I follow a lot of you folks on YouTube and your social movements. So mine is a question more of post-election thoughts. How do you think, pro-peace, we'll just put pro-peace, writ large, movements can help insulate themselves from backlash, most likely from liberals, and maybe not in all the details, but do you think that all three, Cornell, Claudia, and Jill, are taking necessary steps to build out capacity post-election so we can we can still maintain some of the momentum that we've had from the election, especially on the anti-genocide aspect? Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much for that. Next, I have Lynn Neely. Lynn, please go ahead.
Thank you. This is for Sarah Flounders. You talked about building the work that we have to do is after the elections, and I'm more curious about that. And if you wanted something more specific, in Portland, Oregon, a lot of the left is consumed with this imperialist war that's impending with China. And, the U.S. is placing so many tariffs on China, and there's all this anti-China stuff going on. If you wanted something more specific, that would be it. But mostly just, what do you see our work is? Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. And finally, Damita Brown, please go ahead.
Thank you so much for doing this. I have to admit, I have fallen for the lesser of two evils thing for a long time. And I'm not voting this year. So I agree with Dr. Du Bois. No more voting, just like, I know he didn't mean it that way, but my question is about, we know that the electoral system itself is broken. And so even a good, viable third-party candidate has no chance within it. But even if they could get into it, the electoral system itself is broken. So what are we telling ourselves about, what are you guys telling people about, this whole not falling for the electoral charade, but organizing yourselves in your communities, irregardless of what's going on the national scene? Because I think as this thing falls apart and as the abandonment of the infrastructure and like someone was pointing out, you can't have all these missiles and childcare, like that doesn't work. So they've been abandoning the infrastructure, and us, the working class and ordinary people, that's their MO. But how do we turn away from the charade of the electoral system so that we're actually building consciousness and building the alternative, a parallel movement? So we're not killing each other in the streets when there's no civil order left. I know I sound like apocalyptic, but you know what we're looking at right now is a disintegration that is going to accelerate. And I want us to have an alternative. So I hope that makes some sense there, but thank you.
Absolutely, Damita. I don't think you're being apocalyptic. I think the situation is kind of getting close to that. So I think since Ajamo had the only question Ajamo and Sarah had questions directed at them, I will ask them to speak in that order. Ajamo and then Sarah, and then I will also ask Ajamo and Sarah to say anything regarding any of the other questions they wanted to respond to, and then I'll go to Wilma and Margaret in that order. So, Ajamo, please go ahead. And yeah, please make sure you're unmuted. Oh, have I? Hang on. Yeah, okay, now you should be able to. Sorry about that.
No problem. Thank you so much. And thank you all for those very important questions. Just briefly on Ukraine, I really think that was a very important question to these raise. But I think the answer on Ukraine will be dependent on who, in fact, wins this election. If the Democrats win, then I think there's a real possibility of continued escalation. It's quite clear that the war is over. In fact, it's been over for about a year. Just like Afghanistan, the war is over. It was over for 10 years before people wanted to admit it. There will be a continued escalation, and a dangerous one at that, because the gains that have been made by the Russian Federation, the losses of Ukraine, are not going to be reversed. They can only be dealt with through diplomatic means. But if there's an attempt to further militarize the situation, allowing, for example, the Ukrainians to begin to strike deep into Russian territory, who knows where that might escalate. If the Trump forces win, I do see that there's going to be a move toward ending this conflict, only because Trump wants to keep the focus on what he was focused on from the very beginning. And what is that? What they see as the main competitor, China. And he wanted to attempt to try to carry out his strategy and the strategy of some very important elements in the foreign policy community to bring the Russians closer to the West and to the U.S. in particular. I don't think that can happen now. It's the consequence of this bloodletting, but I do see that this Ukrainian situation and the money pit it has become will in fact be over. Real quickly on the other questions, the one thing that I'm a little bit concerned about, I don't like using this term left when it comes to liberals collapsing what is our attempt to try to reconsolidate an authentic left that is anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist with liberal reformism and call both of them the same thing. I can think that's a little bit confusing. I do think that it's easier for the radical right, the traditional radical right represented by the Trumpian forces, to organize their constituents because they are engaged in a kind of demagoguery that makes it easier, especially if the focus is on social issues, which it has to be, because you can't really effectively talk about economic issues when you are still primarily pro-capitalist. And then lastly, the very important question that Namita raised, one of the things that we say very clearly is that this bourgeois electoral process is a place that is a terrain of contestation. That the fact of the matter is there's millions of people who are in this arena I think is unconscionable. In fact, maybe even irresponsible for us not to be in that arena, contending with those forces. And basically, without confusing people around the notion, and Sarah reminded us of this, that we're going to bring about fundamental change through the electoral process. We can talk about and do talk about how this process can in fact be used as part of a broader strategic, broader strategy for building popular independent power, in particular on the local level. So it's a very nuanced and I think sophisticated approach, but one that I think we are required to in fact experiment with more and more effectively. And on that last piece too, the fact of the matter is that liberal democracy and liberal rights have been completely abandoned by the liberal bourgeoisie. It has put the left in this really interesting and strange position, maybe, of having to, in fact, defend bourgeois rights. Why? So we can at least keep some space of opposition. We don't want to have to be pushed underground or into illegality, okay? So we've got to remind people that these bourgeois rights, in fact, exist and they have to be defended. So that, again, that's a very nuanced kind of thing because, of course, people who want to posture on the left would then suggest you are not being sufficiently radical or revolutionary. But that's part of the immaturity we have here in the U.S.
Thank you, Ajamu. Sarah, please go ahead.
All right, well, these are all big questions, so let me just try it briefly. On China, we got to take this seriously. The U.S. threats on China, and both candidates tried to outdo each other with threats on China. And then you have folks like U.S. Air Force General Mike Minihan saying there will be war with China by 2025. We should take this seriously. The threats, the preparation, the aircraft carriers, the encirclement by planes, the tariffs, all of this, and it's being whipped up and using the electoral cycle to do the whipping up. So it's one area, very important area, where you got to think outside the electoral arena. Now, that also raises a more fundamental question about how the electoral system is so stacked and an intentional way of taking attention off the issues that are moving millions of people into the streets. And they really have done that intentionally on Palestine, where tens of thousands, every university campus, and then by just talking election, have tried to erode and destroy that movement, thinking anything would come from the U.S. Congress, where to be a politician at any level, you got to support Israel, this really settler, criminal apartheid state. But it was always the same way. We could look at Iraq, Afghanistan. In the Congress, no significant anti-war votes, no real opposition coming from inside the Congress or the presidency. We could look at the civil rights movement, the union movement for union rights. Those gains were won in the streets. LGBTQ rights. And as I say, the struggles against war, it didn't come, not one of the gains came from Congress deciding or the Supreme Court deciding it was only when millions of people were mobilized from below. And that's where, in my opinion, we gotta look. We gotta just even think back to the Vietnam War, where whether it was troops refusing to fight or people going to Canada or the millions in the streets, and the resistance of the Vietnamese themselves. After all of that was passed and the troops were actually home, finally, the US Congress passed a vote, some sort of a loose anti-war vote, when it was all said and done. So depending on this electoral system is really a no-win situation, and being out there confronting and knowing at the same time, because this is never, in the electoral system, it all gets lost and muddied. Here you have a situation where this Zionist settler state has failed utterly failed to defeat the Palestinian resistance or defeat the resistance in Yemen, in Lebanon. The war is widening. And yet in Congress and the elector, the presidential candidates, you wouldn't know that. And the same thing is true for Ukraine. Really, it's collapsing, absolutely. As far as the US is concerned, more money for NATO, that super profits, they're all for it, even when wars utterly fail, which is true for Afghanistan. You can leave a rubble. Those billionaires made a killing. So I think we have to consciously look outside, and also just thinking, and again, on the question of China, we got to be thinking of the alliances that, because they're really anti-imperialist alliances, are more likely to resonate and to link the issues, whether it's China really as one country. You look at the BRICS and the Belt and Road, who's offering an alternative. And so standing up to this anti-China sentiment, so important. And at the same time, identifying with and giving solidarity to resistance movements around the world, I think is more important than at any time. And it's where the whole global South is looking. They aren't looking. Actually, there was more interest, I think, in what was happening at the BRICS a couple of weeks ago than there is in the outcome of the elections in a couple of days on a global scale. And so we need to turn our head around, thinking these US elections are so important. They'll make a big change for us. They won't. So I think this is important. It's even important to think of how has Cuba survived all these years, or Venezuela. It wasn't an appeal to the Congress. It was an appeal to their own population and the people of the whole global South. So we're in a decaying system. Let's understand that. There is a frustration on the part of working people of what needs aren't being met. Let's do our best to mobilize them and get past these lose-lose elections.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Voting is absolutely not enough, and perhaps not even where the game is at, particularly after where things have come to in the United States in particular. So thank you very much for that. I know there are two other questions, but I suspect we won't be able to take them. So let me just say that, we are going to have a post-election campaign as well, not because these elections are important, but because they will have interesting and important consequences. So please do attend. Please discuss how we can recreate a broader left front in what follows after the 5th of November. But for now, I will hand over to Wilma and then Margaret.
There we go. So on the issue of Ukraine, I think to follow up to Ajamu's very accurate assessment, the question in the minds of many is not so much Ukraine as how do you get to China? And so you have one faction that believes that you get to China by weakening Russia. Then you have another faction that believes that you can just take China on straight away. What is being lost in a lot of this so-called analysis is the growing relationship, not only economic, but defensive, between China and Russia. And you also then have to factor North Korea into that dynamic, because North Korea's relationship with China and Russia has developed as well. Then there's the technology involved. The United States does not have the horsepower. When was the last time the United States won a conflict? World War II. What makes anybody in this country think that we can take on China with their hypersonic capabilities, with Russia's Kinzhal hypersonic capabilities? What did Putin say to Biden when Biden sent, I think it was the Eisenhower, into the Mediterranean? He said, "Why are you doing this? You're not scaring anybody. These people don't scare." He said, "Oh, by the way, we can sink your aircraft carrier from here, from the Black Sea, with Kinjal missiles. So we can't even defeat the Houthis. We can't defeat Ansar Allah in Yemen. What makes us think?" I could rant on that for an hour. So that's that. Also, final point on that. Who's actually leading the charge here? Because a lot of this militarism and jingoistic rhetoric seems to be coming from the State Department. It seems to be coming from Tony Blinken and that crew, as opposed to the generals, because the generals realize that the State Department's trying to draw them into a fight that'll be nothing but a whipping. And so with that, in terms of the Democrats' leadership, I think that question was spot on. The Republicans are aggressive, and instead of putting it right and left, I'll put it Democrat Republican. Because we're dealing with a duopoly, I believe that the fact that the questioner asked or made the point that the Democrats are soft, that's because the leadership is soft, particularly as it relates to the African American community. And part of that, what contributes to part of that, I believe, is that the Democrats have always, well, since the late 50s to the 60s, have tried to play to the African American community while placating the demographic of the white middle class male. Democrats have not wanted to appear to be the party of Black people. So they come to us at election time, patting us on the head, talking to us about what they think we want to hear, but then they don't back that up with substantive legislation and policy, because, again, they don't want to appear, or they don't want to alienate what they perceive to be the group that they're always appealing to, which is white middle class males.
Thanks very much, Wilma, again. And finally, Margaret, you get the last word.
Thanks, Radhika. On Ukraine, as Jamu said, it's over, but there does always seem to be a bottomless pit, even when something is over. Right now, they're trying to hold it together to make sure Ukraine, the army, what's left of it, doesn't collapse before January 20th, when Joe Biden leaves office. The Europeans are tapped militarily. They have nothing left to give to Ukraine. The US is the one that can keep it going. I know Trump wants to change US policy towards Russia, but he was thwarted. That was, after all, the point of Russiagate, to keep him from changing US policy. And then, of course, we have these maniacs who believe that the US can and should take on China and Russia simultaneously, while Xi Jinping said China and Russia are, quote, better than allies. I don't know what's better than an ally, but I think any Trump thinking he can undo this alliance is wishful thinking on his part. As far as the two parties, as far as the right being, I think the question here is the US is fundamentally a reactionary country. So I think it's easier for the right to get a hearing, because they are actually playing to the foundations, the fundamentals of this system. So I don't think we should be surprised that we have such public and defined, self-defined right-wingers in this country in politics, but hardly anyone even pretending to be on the left. As far as the issue of mobilizing outside of politics, out of electoral politics, we have to. We don't have a choice. We have not mentioned the climate. This is something that neither party has addressed. No country actually has addressed very well. But we see that this effort to keep the climate from climbing above 1.5 degrees C is not working out. And so we are going to have to mobilize just to help ourselves, even as we also contest in the electoral arena.
Thank you, Margaret, so much. Let me thank everyone who was here and who seems to have, most people seem to have stayed till the very end, which is really amazing. I mean, it is a paradox that on the one hand, it kind of, because it doesn't really matter so much who wins, things are going to simply keep getting worse. One rightly points out that the election is of no consequence. On the other hand, as we know, it will be of great consequence to people all over the world, whether they are in Ukraine or Gaza or in China or in any other part of the world which is affected by US foreign policy, simply because it will constitute a further continuation of the same horrific policies that the US has been following. It also seems to me that American so-called democracy has come to such a pass when the righteous anger of hundreds of thousands of Puerto Ricans may end up simply electing one side or another of an equally bad duo. So this is the kind of thing we're at. Please remember that we will probably be meeting again to talk about the same processes, but after we know what difference has been made by Tuesday. I would like to thank all the co-sponsors of this event, which is the United National Anti-War Coalition, the Black Agenda Report, and Black Alliance for Peace. They all have websites. Please visit them. And of course, I'd like you to also take an interest, if you haven't already, in the International Manifesto Group. Go to our website, read our manifesto, sign up, volunteer, donate, do what you can for all of these organizations. So thank you very much again for being part of this. Thank you to all the speakers, and once again to all the audience, including our YouTube audience. Thank you and goodbye.
Make sure to save the chat.
Save the chat. Okay, folks, the chat is saved, and hope to see you all soon. Bye-bye. Now, how do I end this? This is a new one.
You don't have to, actually. Well,
I can just close it. Okay, there.